Hi, I'm Peter Capaldi. I play the Doctor, and you're watching EMS Productions.
Hello everybody and welcome along to today's video. Apologies, it's been forever since I last did a video. I've just not had enough time to make it. But today I'm back and we are reviewing Shada, the finally completed version of Shada. Yes, as I say, apologies that it's been way too long since I last did a video. I just haven't had any time to make videos. Work's been very busy and I just don't really have that much time during the week generally. But I'm back now and hopefully I can start to pump out a few more videos in the lead up to Christmas, and of course Twice Upon a Time. I cannot wait. But today of course we are reviewing Shada, the episode that's just been released or re-released after 40 years I think nearly since it was originally done, but then not actually completed because of strikes at the BBC during the time it was meant to be filmed. So a lot of it was not filmed and it was never shown on TV. But finally, thanks to the power of animation and lots of clever people, we have Shada officially created. And I've got here the fantastic steelbook that they produced for it. Looks absolutely lovely there, as you can see. And just for anybody who's interested in terms of the bonus features on it, Disc 3, the mysterious Disc 3 of Shada, is just the 1992 VHS version and the 2003 animation. There is nothing else on it, so if you don't care about those, just buy the normal version, I would have said. But Shada, for me, it was a very interesting one because I'd never actually watched Shada in any form before. I didn't really know anything about Shada at all, so it was quite nice for me to have a completely fresh perspective on this episode, whereas I know for the majority of people watching this story, they've seen a version of it in the past or maybe read the novelisation or something like that. So you kind of know what's going to happen plot-wise and are more just looking at how they've chosen to produce it. But for me, I didn't know anything about this story, so it was really great to be able to look at not just the production, but the actual plot and the story itself. And really kind of, I'm able to give a bit more of an opinion on that side of things as well. And I guess for me that's probably the first thing worth tackling is the actual plot of the story, which I'm not going to try and explain the plot as such, but I think it is actually a very good story. It's sort of something that I don't think they maybe tackled very often in classic Who, certainly that era of it. There wasn't, because this is very much a sort of story of Time Lords. We get another Time Lord in Doctor Who. Of that time, which was very, very rare and something we sort of saw 3 or 4 times in the whole of classic Who, really. So to have this Professor Chronotis, who's actually Sally Avon, this sort of criminal Time Lord who has these mind-controlling or mind-wiping powers, to have that as a character in the show was very unusual for the time, and so it was quite nice to have something. It just felt like a very different story. Obviously it was Douglas Adams' third attempt at a Doctor Who story. And obviously he's brilliant, he's a genius, his mind is just made for Doctor Who. It's such a shame he never did more Doctor Who stories. But I thought it was just a very good idea behind this, and the kind of the twist and the play on the whole, usually it's just some mad villain, mad bloke trying to take over the universe. He was trying to he wasn't doing that, he was trying to make the whole universe into one mind and one power to control, which sort of, in the scene where they kind of play, he explains what his plan is, Skagra. It's quite funny to kind of, it feels like Douglas Adams is almost playing with you and kind of saying, yes, this is what the silly villain normally does, but we're going to slightly tweak it just to make it a bit more interesting for you all. But it is still basically the same plot that he's trying to take over the whole world. Just he wants it to be one mind instead of him own it. It's a slight difference. I just thought that was a brilliantly sort of well-crafted scene, probably written by Douglas Adams back in the time, and was a really kind of just a nice little twist on the classic a madman trying to take over the universe. And so yeah, there were just lots of really sort of interesting ideas about this whole shared mind idea that Skagra's got this sort of experiment to be able to kind of suck out people's minds and merge them all together into one controllable force. Was quite, yeah, a nice idea behind that, and something a little bit different to what we're used to in Doctor Who, or sort of something more about mind control and the ideas behind that, which was quite interesting. And I think Skagra, the sort of character, I don't know who played him, I haven't looked into it, but he did a very good job of it. Obviously, there was a bit of the over-the-top Doctor Who villain, slightly campy, which is what you get. I mean, his costume was a bit ridiculous, and it's quite funny watching him walk around Cambridge in that outfit. It's obviously intentional, but does look hilariously out of place, really. But he plays it really, really well. And obviously it's got to be a favourite character of mine is Professor Chronotis, the sort of silly old man who's kind of pretending to be a silly old man. But his hilarious sort of making people tea all the time and always asking exactly the same questions to everybody about their tea, and It's just a kind of nice, heartwarming little lines that he has there in this sort of crazy or slightly crazy mad old man, but has actually got these secret powers because he's secretly a proper criminal of the Time Lords. But he's just chilling out at university in sort of retirement. So he was sort of one of the best characters of this episode, definitely. Very well crafted Time Lord. And yeah, just something very different to what we normally get in the show. Now, of course, the sort of main thing you probably want to know a bit about if you haven't seen this story as of yet, or at least this version of it, is how it's produced. Because, of course, this episode features a lot of animation as part of it, and it's just slightly differently structured to how maybe a normal Doctor Who story is. So the first kind of key point production-wise that they've chosen to do is to have it all as one story. It's not serialised, it's not split up into 6 episodes, so you don't get the credits and titles every 25 minutes. It is just some titles at the beginning, 2 hours 15 or so, and then credits at the end. There's nothing to break it up, which is... It does work fairly well. I mean, it does kind of make it feel slightly less like a normal Classic Who story, just because you don't have that 6-part serialised style of it and with little cliffhangers every 25 minutes and then coming back into another episode with a recap and whatever. So it does have a slightly different feel because of that, but I don't think it sort of detracts from the story at all. It still works fine as a 2¼ hour piece of drama, really. I think it does a very good job of it. Other things worth noting is for some reason they chose to use a sort of mixed Troughton version of the theme tune. I don't really know why, but it's definitely not the theme tune of the time. I mean, obviously for the next story they did change it anyway, so there wasn't a kind of probably never a proper version of the theme tune to go with that story. But it just seemed a little bit weird they chose to use what seemed to be the Troughton theme but slightly remixed. But there we go, that's what they chose to do. And then the most important thing for this is of course the animation. How does it look? Is it any good? And I have to say I was very impressed. I was pleasantly surprised by how good this animation was. And it's definitely a big improvement on the Power of the Daleks. It's the obvious comparison at the moment to compare it to a sort of similarly produced episode with similar sort of animation team involved with it. But it definitely feels like they've taken a step up in the quality of their animation this time round. It's just a lot smoother in places, whereas with Power of the Daleks, sometimes some of the sort of panning shots and some of the edges on the animation looked a bit rough and looked a little bit rushed. But certainly with Shada, it feels like a lot of care and attention has gone into it. And I almost felt like it just gave a slightly better sort of... It felt more three-dimensional than the Power of the Daleks did, where sometimes some of the scenes looked a little bit flat. You really felt the sort of characters and the settings were really well designed and did look properly sort of 3D, and you really were able to engage in it a little bit more, I thought, which was great. And I mean, it's such a brilliant sort of early on when we go into the very first animation sequence. There's a lovely panning shot in Cambridge up to the sky, and then sort of in that moment it changes to the animated version of the sky and pans back down to Chris cycling along sort of just a street in Cambridge. It's so perfectly kind of merged together, you don't even notice that it's suddenly changing from animation kind of straight away because it's so perfectly done in one camera movement, it seems like. So that was very clever. And it does look really effective, him sort of cycling down the street. It's nicely panned round. It does look lovely, sort of proper 3D, crisp image to it. It really is some impressive animation, I would say. What I will say is that given what I'd heard about this story, I was actually surprised how much of it did exist and how much filming had been done. I sort of was expecting a lot more of it to be missing, because it felt like at least there was probably a good 60 to 70% of it was filmed. There was only a good 30% or so was animated, so I was kind of pleasantly surprised about that, because as good as the animation is, you always want to see the actual footage more than the animation, because it is the real footage, it is proper actual acting and visual film there rather than just animation. So yeah, I was surprised, because I'd never watched it, to see that probably a good hour and a half of it was all there, which was really great. And so definitely for this story I would say the animation did work very well. It didn't feel at any point like the animation sort of deteriorated too much. I mean, naturally with animation like this, you always lose some of the sort of subtleties of it and subtleties of the performance. You don't just see the slight movement of the actors when they're kind of stood still and things like that. It's very basic, it's simple stuff that's normal with any animation like this, but you just sometimes notice it when some shots look a bit too static, simply because there isn't that just natural slight movement of a character from just as you naturally do. But that wasn't really a problem for me, I thought, because it is just the nature of the animation. But it's certainly a credit to them that it does so seamlessly fit into all the actually shot parts of the episode, when you just suddenly cut from one scene that's normal footage and then straight to another scene that's animation, it does, although you do notice, because of course it's very different, it doesn't feel out of place at all. It does just feel like you're still continuing with the story. So I was really pleased about that. I mean, the only other thing which naturally was going to happen, and I did notice, was the voicing of it, the voicing of the characters. You could tell the voices were a bit different. Tom Baker does sound quite different, unfortunately. Of course, there is still the element of his classic sort of voice, which I'm not going to try and do an impression of. But it did just sort of, his voice almost sounded a little bit squeaky at points, a little bit too high pitched. Kind of not quite what I was expecting. I sort of feel, at least from the interviews I've seen, his voice sounds almost more closer to it in interviews than it did in this actual recording of it. I don't really know why, but it did sound a bit like that. So sort of, although it was very similar, you did kind of notice, yes, that is definitely a newly recorded piece of dialogue. It isn't the original stuff, because his voice does just sound that little bit different. Lalla Ward's the same. It's not too noticeable, but if you listen carefully, you can tell, yeah, it isn't the same. It's not quite the same, but it's not really a problem to the story at all. Now, one of the other big things I know a lot of people were interested in was the score for this episode, because of course there'd never been any music composed for this properly. I mean, some of the more newer versions of it, I believe, did have a score on them, which was done not very well, I think, in general fan opinion. But for this version of it, we've got Mark Ayres going back and doing a very fantastically realised 80s, sort of late 70s, 80s Dudley Simpson style score, which I thought was absolutely brilliant and worked perfectly. Definitely he was drawing on elements of City of Death, that sort of nice piano-y theme that's used a few times in City of Death. He was definitely kind of pulled some of the sort of theme of that out of it into his music this time round. But I felt it really worked in the story, and it flowed very nicely, and it did feel like you were watching an episode of Classic Who from that time, because the music did just sort of emanate exactly as it did back then, I think. So that was fantastic. That the score almost at times wasn't that noticeable is a sort of testament to how good it was, that it just fitted so perfectly. The only thing I noticed with listening with earphones to this episode, headphones to this episode, was that the sound, it almost sounded a little bit too good to kind of... Obviously, as I knew it was newly recorded, you're kind of listening for it a little bit more. And you could just slightly tell, yes, that's clearly a brand new recorded audio, some music that's been layered over it, simply because it is, and it does just sound a little bit crisper than when it's been actually sort of mixed onto the original videotape and you're just getting the sound all as one. You could just at times tell that a bit. It wasn't major, and certainly when I watched the last few episodes without headphones, you don't notice it at all, but just the slight subtlety there, you can tell just that little bit that it's been sort of added on and has been recorded recently for it. But that, take nothing away from the actual score, it's fantastic, and I cannot wait to hear an actual soundtrack of this, which I think Mark Ayres has said he's probably going to be doing. So that's going to be great. And one of the other main things that they did sort of finish off and look brilliantly was the model shots they used in this episode. They were so effective and just felt completely 1970s Doctor Who. Of course, they looked a bit rubbish at times, but that was the idea. It's meant to fit in perfectly. And I think that's kind of the key point from all of this story and everything they've added to it, is it still feels very much like a 1970s Doctor Who episode, which is exactly what they were aiming for to start off with, and I think it's realised brilliantly. And well, the last big thing, a little surprise we got for it, spoiler alert if you haven't managed to read this or don't want to know, I know, because it is an addition to the episode rather than something from 40 years ago, is the final scene with actual Tom Baker, 2017 Tom Baker in it, which was just absolutely brilliant. It's only about a minute long, and you only see his face for about 20 seconds. He has about 2 lines as that you can actually see. The rest of it's just standard dialogue. And I have to say the Lalla Ward dialogue sounded a little bit dodgy. It did sound like she was just stood just offset reading it off a script. It did not sound that great, but Tom's performance was fantastic. And his sort of mysterious line about meeting himself in 200 years' time and how he'd look as an old man. I mean, I don't know how you explain in canon that he looks so much older, but I'm sure someone will come up with a nice little fan theory to explain it. That would always be nice. But yes, it was a brilliantly shot little scene there. They clearly used the original 70s cameras, so this sort of footage did look in the same quality that it did, that all the other sort of rest of the episode did. It did have that slightly grainy feel. It really looked like that, and of course the TARDIS set there was there as well, and was really nicely realised for back to how it looked back then. And yeah, as I say, it's just a perfect recreation of a 70s Doctor Who episode. So that was Shada, my first ever experience with Shada, which is probably unlike most of you who have seen a version before, but certainly with this version, if you haven't seen it yet and are wondering whether to get hold of it, I'd 100% say get it. It is a fantastic realisation of a 1970s Doctor Who story in Shada. It's a good story, it's a good plot, and it's also been reproduced with animation and everything perfectly. So if it's not on your Christmas list already, definitely put it on there. But what did you guys think about it? If you have seen it already, or if you're going to be seeing it shortly, what do you guys think about this new version of Shada? Do you like the animation in it? Do you actually think it's a good story or not? Because I know it's generally thought of as quite well, but I know there's been some mixed feelings about the actual story itself. How does it compare to the previous versions of it that you may have seen but I haven't? Just any thoughts or comments you've got about this episode, I'd love to hear them. But apart from that, guys, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about Shada. A fantastic story, definitely worth a buy, but other than that, thank you very much for watching this video. Hopefully I'll be back fairly soon with another one. Ideally within the next week or so, I will make sure I pump out a few more once we get closer to Twice Upon a Time. I will say now there's a small possibility I might be seeing Twice Upon a Time before it airs, thanks to my BBC privileges and stuff. I shouldn't say any more than that, but I might get to go to the press screening if I'm lucky, we'll see. So I may see Twice Upon a Time a bit early, therefore I might record a preview of it a bit early, and if I do see it early there will be a review of it straight after the episode on Christmas Day will be up there. So if that happens, I'll probably tweet about it. I won't give you any spoilers, no chance of having a spoiler before it airs, but I will tweet so that people know it's happened, and therefore there'll be a review on Christmas Day if we're lucky. But other than that, remember to like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and I will see you again, hopefully very soon, for another video. Goodbye!